If you haven't heard of Project 2025, this is going to be something to keep an eye on. I just came across this information last night, but wanted to give a quick update on what I found, as this information has a direct bearing on Bible prophecy and the enforcement of Sunday legislation as the mark of the beast. If you aren't familiar with why the mark of the beast ties into Sunday legislation, I would recommend watching our 3-part documentary series, Unmasking the Mark, which goes into a lot more detail showing how the Bible itself reveals what the mark of the beast is and why. So let's talk about Project 2025. Wikipedia gives a fairly good overview, saying Project 2025 is a far-right plan to purge and reshape the U.S. federal government in the event of a Republican victory in the 2024 United States presidential election. The plan involves various restructuring of government agencies and personnel, with the stated objective being to reverse the woke agenda of the current administration and restore more liberties to the American people. The project's website is project2025.org, and it states it is not enough for conservatives to win elections. If we are going to rescue the country from the grip of the radical left, we need both a governing agenda and the right people in place, ready to carry this agenda out on day one of the next conservative administration. This is the goal of the 2025 Presidential Transition Project.
The New York Times reported in July that Trump and his associates have a broader goal: to alter the balance of power by increasing the president's authority over every part of the federal government that now operates by either law or tradition, with any measure of independence from political interference by the White House. Numerous former Trump officials are involved with Project 2025, and look, it's not some shadowy behind-the-scenes effort. It's been open about its plans to gut worker protections and dismantle environmental protections. It includes their plans to make pushing right-wing Christianity the federal government's job. It's all in there in the nearly 1,000-page playbook calling on the next president to maintain a, quote, biblically based social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. As Guthrie Grace Fitzsimmons writes for MSNBC, concerned about policies of this kind aren't only about the possible return of Donald Trump to office. This is about the next Republican president, whoever it may be, is going to be pushing Christian nationalism.
So Project 2025 includes a long list of policy change recommendations for a conservative president should one come to the White House in January of 2025. The details of the plan are defined and explained in Project 2025's document titled Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise, which is over 900 pages. It is broken into 5 sections, each of them dealing with how to restructure and improve the various government agencies and departments. But the one I want to focus on is the portion dealing with the Department of Labor and Related Agencies, written by Jonathan Berry. This portion of the mandate talks about policies and plans with regard to employees and employers and families and income structures. But of particular interest are the policies regarding Sabbath rest on page 589. Now remember, of course, when they use the word Sabbath, they are referring to Sunday, and you will see they define it as such in this document. I will read the policy and then share a few comments. The policy states, Sabbath rest. God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, and until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. Moreover, a shared day off makes it possible for families and communities to enjoy time off together, rather than as atomized individuals, and provides a healthier cadence of life for everyone. Unfortunately, that communal day of rest has eroded under the pressures of consumerism and secularism, especially for low-income workers. So they clearly stated the problem and the desire to restore Sunday as a communal day of rest. Now they are going to state how they propose to accomplish this. Congress should encourage communal rest by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, to require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath. That day would default to Sunday, except for employers with a sincere religious observance of a Sabbath at a different time. Example, Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. The obligation would transfer to that period instead. Houses of worship, to the limited extent they may have FLSA-covered employees, and employers legally required to operate around the clock, such as hospitals and first responders, would be exempt, as would workers otherwise exempt from overtime. So not employees, but employers or businesses who have a sincere religious observance of a different Sabbath than Sunday, like Saturday, for example, would be required to pay time and a half to employees that work on that day. But as those who keep the Sabbath, we know that God prohibits work on the seventh day. While this policy could encourage workers to desire to work on that day because they would get paid more, it would discourage employers from having employees work on that day. There is still some discussion whether this would accomplish their desired result of everyone, or mostly everyone, having a communal day of rest on Sunday. So the general idea here is to use a policy compelling employers to pay those who work on Sunday overtime wages in order to incentivize those employers to give their employees that day off, thereby influencing businesses not to open on Sunday or to minimize their operations on that day. While this may not seem like a significant push towards Sunday legislation, I would argue that it is, and here's why. In the past 15 or so years that I have been aware that the mark of the beast will involve the enforcement of Sunday legislation, there have been individuals that have promoted Sunday laws or blue laws online, in commentary articles, and there have even been some organizations like European Sunday Alliance or the Lord's Day Alliance that have worked to promote Sunday rest. But these efforts have largely all been from the private sector or from organizations or churches outside of government agencies. They are influential agencies, but here in this Project 2025 Mandate for Leadership, we see a concrete plan written up for governmental policy changes for the next conservative president. This is not an article promoting Sunday observance in some periodical piece, nor is this a plea for Sunday observance by a church or religious organization. But this is a carefully crafted policy to put laws into place that would incentivize a common day of rest on Sunday. This portion of the Mandate for Leadership with regard to the Department of Labor was written by Jonathan Berry, whose profile on the Federalist Society website says Jonathan Berry provides strategic counsel and litigates on issues at the intersection of law, politics, and public policy. They add, in government, Mr. Berry headed the regulatory office at the U.S. Department of Labor, where he oversaw the development process of dozens of proposed and final rules. As the regulatory policy officer, he regularly represented the department to the Executive Office of the President and the Office of Management and Budget. So he worked at the Department of Labor, overseeing the development of legal policies, and represented the Department of Labor to the Executive Office of the President. So this is not just somebody with an idea to promote Sunday as a day of rest, but someone who actually has the capacity to do so and make the recommendation to the President. Here's what Jonathan, who is now a managing partner at Boyden Gray & Associates, a public policy firm, had to say about these Sabbath policies in a recent interview.
But there are implications for social conservative values across many issues. One of the interesting proposals that you've laid out in Project 2025 handbook from Heritage is stuff around the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ideas that you have there?
Yes. This is, it sounds controversial. Mm-hmm. In many respects, it is a return to something that basically always everyone ever had. Mm-hmm. And it's specifically the idea of encouraging Sabbath rest through discouraging commerce on the Sabbath. The proposal that's in our book is amending the basic federal overtime law, Fair Labor Standards Act, to require that overtime be paid for all work done on the Sabbath.
Interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't think I don't think Congress has the authority to mandate like a national closing on the Sabbath. That was always a state decision to do that. But let me add, it was always a state decision to do that.
They did it.
and yeah, I'm not saying this practice was uniform, homogenous, whatever, but very, very widely spread, and only recently in the last few decades have most states moved away from this. So this is, I think this is about as far as the federal government could properly go in this space, but it would be an encouragement and inducement to rest, but really to kind of coordinate commercial activity for the other 6 days of the week, which is as long as we've had Sabbatarian civilization, beginning in Israel and continuing into Christendom. This is something that's been increasingly a part of the rhythm of civic life. Most importantly, for people to have space to worship and honor God, and secondly, to have times of communal rest with their families and with their communities.
I find it interesting. He said, I don't think Congress has the authority to mandate a national closing. I find that interesting because Congress has ruled in the past that it does have the authority to mandate a national closing when it is for secular reasons. Here is what we read from Cornell Law School's website regarding the constitutionality of Sunday closing laws. The history of Sunday closing laws goes back to the United States colonial history and far back into English history. Commonly, the laws require the observance of the Christian Sabbath as a day of rest, although in recent years they have tended to become honeycombed with exceptions. The Supreme Court rejected an Establishment Clause challenge to Sunday closing laws in McGowan versus Maryland. The court acknowledged that historically, the laws had a religious motivation and were designed to effectuate concepts of Christian theology. So, in fact, Congress has ruled in the past that the enforcement of Sunday laws are constitutional when they are enacted for secular purposes, not realizing, of course, that by so doing, Satan will be gathering the entire world under his banner, which is the day he claims to be a day of reverence and worship to him in the place of God's seventh-day Sabbath, which God has claimed to be a sign of allegiance to him, saying, And hallow my Sabbaths, and they shall be a sign between me and you, that ye may know that I am the Lord your God. It is not without significance that these policies concerning overtime pay for workers on Sunday comes from the Department of Labor, as the civil institution driving Sunday laws in the past also came from the labor unions. Today, the Christian churches throughout our land are very conscious of their diminishing moral force, lamenting the lack of church attendance and lack of influence for moral reform in the Western world. As such, it would only be natural for the religious right to turn to the state to enact legislation enforcing the observance of religious institutions, like their communal day of rest on Sunday. And as it was said previously, that churches and labor unions combined are politically irresistible, so too it will be the case today. In 1888, a newspaper from Chicago called the Union Signal commented on the proposed Sunday legislation. Labor unions are now united with the churches in demanding such legislation. Our wheelbarrow government never does anything without pushing. But with the churches pushing with all their might at one handle of the wheelbarrow, and the labor unions doing the same at the other, it must move and carry its load, Sunday observance, along with it. When Pilate and Herod were made friends, Christ had to be crucified. One of the reasons this mandate for leadership document has such strong potential to become the working policy of the next conservative president is because of the influence and power of the Heritage Foundation, who is behind Project 2025. What is the Heritage Foundation? They describe themselves as a research and educational institution whose mission is to build and promote conservative public policies based in Washington, D.C. At this point, I want to look at Paul Dans, who is the Heritage Foundation's director for the Presidential Transition Project, which is responsible for Project 2025.
What is Project 2025? It's a call for you to come work here, Washington, D.C.
Conservatives face a tough challenge in Washington, the swamp. The left has built a system that blocks and sabotages our efforts to run our government and deliver a conservative agenda.
People would come into the government on behalf of a president and not be bought into the agenda that he was elected to do. They were either uncommitted or incompetent.
Things aren't going to change unless you commit to serving our country.
We want to make sure that the plans that are in place have been vetted so that the person knows not only what argument and excuses come in their way, but what the answer is, and have the trust of a movement-wide effort led by the Heritage Foundation to make sure that they know that it's credible and it's conservative.
This time, we have a secret weapon. This time, we have Project 2025. By learning from the experience of former conservative appointees, we can overcome common obstacles and get things done.
The reason I got involved is because I wanted to be part of a movement-led effort, and Heritage Foundation has used their influence to be able to convene the movement.
We can be ready to hit the ground running on day one of the next administration. In the wise words of Morton Blackwell, you owe it to your philosophy to study how to win. Project 2025 will ensure a conservative agenda is ready to roll on day number one.
Make sure that we, as conservatives, are prepared to hit the ground running January 20th, 2025. To learn more, go to project2025.org.